So, picture the year 1720.
Okay, 1720, setting the scene.
Yeah, and we're looking at Sir Isaac Newton. I mean, the guy who literally mathematically defined gravity. He invented calculus. He, fundamentally rewired our entire understanding of the physical universe.
Right, arguably the smartest man on the planet at the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this absolute genius lost his entire life savings in a stock market bubble.
Oh, the South Sea Company.
Yeah, the South Sea bubble. And the crazy thing is he actually made a massive profit early on. He invested, the stock went up, and he cashed out. He did the smart thing. But then he just had to sit there and watch his friends getting richer and richer as the bubble kept inflating.
The FOMO is timeless, honestly.
It really is. The social pressure mounted, the FOMO completely kicked in, and the smartest man in the world bought back in at the absolute peak of the market. And he lost everything.
Wow.
He famously said afterward that he could calculate the motions of heavenly bodies, but not the madness of men.
I mean, it's just a spectacular failure of human rationality. And, the most unsettling part of that whole story is that 300 years later, we are still stepping on the exact same landmines that Newton did.
We really are. And think about the tools we have now. We have billion-dollar supercomputers trying to calculate that madness. We have, tactical military units wearing real-time biometric sensors. We have solo entrepreneurs just swimming in algorithmic data.
Oh, yeah, the sheer volume of data is staggering.
Right. You sitting there listening to this deep dive right now, you probably have access to more raw data on your smartphone than the entire global financial system had just a few decades ago. And yet, highly trained professionals, from Wall Street traders to military operators, they consistently make these catastrophic decisions despite having the best, X-ray machines that money can buy. Why is that?
Well, because we've built these incredibly sophisticated systems to measure almost everything externally, right? But we consistently and almost structurally fail to account for the internal stuff, the biological and psychological factors that actually drive our decision-making when we are under severe pressure.
We're looking outward instead of inward.
Exactly. We treat human beings like they're just rational nodes in a network rather than, biological engines running on finite resources.
Which brings us to the core mission of today's deep dive. We are going to explore the hidden intersections between how we manage systemic risk, how our underlying biology, specifically the mechanics of heart rate variability, dictates our choices under pressure, and how professional isolation secretly kind of pulls the strings behind the scenes.
It's a massive topic.
It is, and we're pulling from a huge stack of research today to do it. We've got the CFA Institute's guides on risk management, tactical military studies on physiological monitoring, qualitative research into the exploding freelance economy, systemic analyses of economic prime movers, and even comparative case studies on national healthcare integration.
And I think for the listener, the thread connecting all of these seemingly disparate fields is causality. You cannot truly understand macrosystemic risks, whether that's a global market crash or the failure of a public healthcare network, without first understanding the microbiological risks happening inside the human body and how those isolated human decisions aggregate into massive structural flaws.
Let's start with the illusion of control, because there is a fundamental disconnect, heavily detailed in Thomas Coleman's text for the CFA Institute, between risk measurement and risk management.
Right, and confusing those two is usually the first step toward a total disaster for anyone managing a team or a portfolio or a business.
So break that down for us. What is the difference?
Well, risk measurement is entirely quantitative. It's the realm of the quants and the statisticians. They calculate metrics like value at risk, or VAR.
Let's define VAR real quick for the listener.
Sure. So VAR is a statistical technique used to measure the level of financial risk within a firm or an investment portfolio over a specific time frame. So it tells a desk manager that under normal market conditions, there is, say, a 95% confidence level that the portfolio will not lose more than $10 million in a single day.
Okay, so it gives you a number.
Exactly. It's a thermometer. It gives you a highly precise number.
But, taking a patient's temperature doesn't cure the fever.
Right.
And looking at a VAR model doesn't stop a trader from panic selling when the market drops 20% in an hour.
Yeah.
Because the model assumes a normal distribution of events, a bell curve.
Yeah.
But human panic doesn't operate on a bell curve.
Which is where risk management enters the picture. Management is qualitative. It's the messy business of managing actual people, designing processes, and making decisions based on incomplete, often completely contradictory information.
It's not just a spreadsheet.
Not at all. Coleman points out that a board of directors cannot simply outsource risk to a, risk management department and wash their hands of it. Risk management isn't a compliance checkbox. It is the core competency of the business. If
Huh.
you aren't managing risk, you aren't capitalizing on opportunity.
But the mechanics of managing those people get complicated instantly, right? Because of the principal-agent problem.
Oh, absolutely. This is huge.
It's essentially the misalignment of incentives between the owners of a firm, those are the principals, and the employees or managers and the agents.
It's a structural friction that permeates almost every large institution on Earth. The owners want long-term stability and sustained growth. But the agents say, a portfolio manager or a proprietary trader, they are often compensated with massive bonuses based on short-term profits.
Okay, think about it like hiring someone to house sit for you while you go on a month-long vacation.
Yeah.
If you pay them a flat, guaranteed rate, their incentive as the agent is to do the absolute bare minimum, right?
Right, keep the house from burning down, feed the dogs, sit on the couch.
Exactly.
Mhm.
But suppose you structure their compensation differently. Suppose you tell them, hey, I'll pay you a massive bonus based on how much revenue you can generate using my property while I'm gone.
The dynamic completely shifts.
Radically. They might decide to throw a massive, highly risky underground rave and charge a massive cover fee. The house sitter gets all the upside of the ticket sales. But if the house gets completely trashed, the police show up and the property value plummets.
The house sitter just walks away.
Yeah, they might lose the gig. But you, the principal, are left holding the bag for catastrophic damages.
And in finance, the stakes are magnified exponentially because the house is a multi-billion-dollar portfolio and the party is heavily leveraged derivatives. The trader gets the upside of the short-term win, but if the highly leveraged trade blows up, the firm's shareholders absorb the catastrophic losses.
Because the trader doesn't lose their personal capital to the tune of billions.
Exactly. Designing compensation structures to align these incentives is one of the most difficult and, frankly, underappreciated aspects of risk management.
To really grasp how to manage this, Coleman brings in a fascinating analogy from backcountry skiing. He draws on the work of an avalanche expert named Bruce Tremper. He basically compares managing financial risk to managing avalanche risk.
I love this analogy because in the backcountry, risk isn't an abstract value at risk number on a spreadsheet. It's literal life and death.
Yeah, you miscalculate, a mountain of snow buries you.
Tremper's framework is highly applicable here because it breaks risk management down into 3 distinct operational phases. The first phase is foundational knowledge. So you have to learn about avalanches in general. When do they occur? What kind of terrain is dangerous? This is the equivalent of deeply studying a new financial market before you deploy a single dollar of capital.
Right, basic education.
Then the second phase is assessing specific daily conditions. Is the snowpack stable today? Did it rain last night? That is your daily risk measurement, evaluating your specific portfolio exposures on any given Tuesday.
But the third component is where the actual management happens,
Right.
right? It's the creation of damage control strategies.
Mm-hmm.
Because human error is completely inevitable.
Yes.
In the backcountry, you don't just rely on your ability to perfectly predict an avalanche. You ski with an avalanche beacon, a collapsible probe, and a shovel. You have protocol with your team. If an avalanche hits, wearing that beacon gives you a 50 to 80% chance of being recovered alive by your partners.
And without it, your chances are effectively zero.
Zero. The equivalent in corporate or financial risk management is having robust, flexible processes designed for failure. It's knowing exactly who makes the call when an unexpected shock hits, because the statistical models will fail eventually.
They always do. And they usually fail because of what the texts call the human factor.
Which brings us right back to Isaac Newton. The CFA text explicitly highlights 4 psychological traps that trigger these avalanches. There's familiarity, meaning we drop our guard when we are in territory we think we know. There's commitment, where we become so dedicated to a specific goal or a trade that we completely ignore new contrary evidence.
We just put blinders on?
Yeah. Then there's belief inertia, the reality that it takes a massive amount of overwhelming evidence to change a deeply held belief. And finally, the herding instinct, social proof, the exact thing that wiped Newton out.
And this is exactly why quantitative intelligence does not inherently translate to risk management capability. True risk management, as the philosopher Nicholas Riescher suggests in the text, is about opportunity capitalization. It's what he calls managing luck.
Okay, wait, hold on. I got to stop you there. Is it actually possible to manage luck? Because that sounds like the kind of arrogant thing a hedge fund manager says right before they lose $1 billion. You can't control the roll of the dice.
No, you can't control the dice. And Richer's premise isn't about controlling the probability of a random event. It's about aggressively controlling your exposure to that event.
Okay, explain that.
You can't control if a black swan event like a sudden global pandemic or a sovereign debt default happens in the market. But you can absolutely control how highly leveraged your firm is when it does. Managing luck means positioning yourself strategically so that when good luck strikes, the payoff is exponential. But when bad luck strikes, your downside is strictly capped by your damage control strategies. You wear the beacon so you survive the bad luck.
Okay, that makes total sense. We manage the exposure, not the event itself.
Yeah.
But if risk management is fundamentally about managing human behavior, managing the panic, the hurting, the overconfidence, we can't just look at balance sheets or organizational flowcharts.
No, we have to look under the hood.
Exactly. We have to look at the biological engine driving those exact behaviors. We need to look at what physically happens inside the body when the avalanche hits.
And this is where the research on tactical military personnel becomes profoundly relevant to anyone making high-stakes decisions, whether you're a CEO, a doctor, or an entrepreneur. The foundation of this biological engine is the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS.
So the ANS is the subconscious control center. It regulates everything you don't have to think about: breathing, digestion, heart rate. And it has two main branches constantly pulling against each other. First, you have the sympathetic nervous system, the SNS.
The gas pedal.
Yes, think of this as the body's gas pedal. It's the fight-or-flight response. When a threat appears, the SNS dumps adrenaline and cortisol into your system, your heart rate spikes, your pupils dilate to take in more light, and blood gets shunted away from your digestive tract and straight into your muscles.
It's pure survival mode. And on the other side, pulling in the opposite direction, is the parasympathetic nervous system, the PNS. This is the brake pedal, the rest and digest system.
And its primary conduit is the vagus nerve.
Right. Exactly. The vagus nerve wanders from your brainstem all the way down through your vital organs. When the threat passes, the PNS releases acetylcholine, slowing your heart rate and allowing your body to actually repair and recover.
Now, traditionally, if we wanted to measure how stressed someone was, say a pilot or a trader, we'd just measure their heart rate. But the source material from the tactical studies points out that simple heart rate is a completely blunt instrument. It doesn't tell the whole story. To really understand the nervous system, we have to look at heart rate variability, or HRV.
Right. Because HRV is not your heart rate. It is the microscopic variation in time measured in milliseconds between successive heartbeats. Your heart is not a metronome.
So my heart rate is 60 beats per minute. It is not beating exactly once every 1.0 seconds.
No, the gap might be 0.9 seconds, then 1.15 seconds, then 0.85 seconds.
And for anyone listening who thinks a perfectly steady metronomic heartbeat sounds like a sign of good health, it's actually the exact opposite. You want high variability.
You absolutely want high variability. High HRV means your nervous system is incredibly responsive, adaptable, and constantly micro-adjusting. It means the parasympathetic brake and the sympathetic gas pedal are in a healthy, dynamic tug of war.
And low HRV.
Low HRV, where the heart beats like a metronome, means your system is completely locked up. The parasympathetic brake has been totally lifted, and the sympathetic gas pedal is pinned to the floor. It indicates chronic stress, fatigue, or severe overtraining.
You mentioned specific metrics in the research, like RMSSD. And for the listener, this isn't just a random acronym thrown around by sports scientists. It stands for the root mean square of successive differences.
It's a mouthful.
It is, but it's basically a time domain calculation, essentially a mathematical magnifying glass, specifically tuned to that vagus nerve we talked about. Because the parasympathetic system operates almost instantaneously to slow the heart down, whereas the sympathetic system takes a bit longer to speed it up via hormones.
Right, so looking at the beat-to-beat variance through RMSSD tells us exactly how hard that brake pedal is being pushed at any given moment.
And we also look at frequency domain metrics, specifically the ratio between high frequency and low frequency bands.
Yes. High frequency is heavily correlated with parasympathetic activity, while low frequency is a mix of both. By monitoring these, military researchers can accurately track a tactical operator's internal load versus their external load.
Let's define that because it applies directly to the civilian workforce too. Think about your own day, right? External load is the objective work you did. You sat in 6 hours of meetings, you wrote a 20-page brief, you managed 3 crisis calls. For a soldier, it's rucking 50 miles with an 80-pound pack.
That's the external reality.
But the internal load is the actual physiological cost that work extracted from your biological reservoir. And 2 people can experience the exact same external load, but have wildly different internal costs depending on their baseline fitness, their sleep quality, their genetics, and their prior stress exposure.
And the critical mechanism linking this biological cost to catastrophic decision-making is found in the neurovisceral integration model.
Oh, this is fascinating.
It really is. This model maps out how the heart and the brain communicate bidirectionally. It demonstrates that your HRV is directly linked to the function of your prefrontal cortex.
And the prefrontal cortex is basically the evolutionary crown jewel of the human brain. It's sitting right up front behind your forehead. It's responsible for complex executive functions, abstract thinking, emotion regulation, long-term planning, and weighing probabilities. It's the part of the brain that looks at a VR model and actually understands standard deviations.
But the prefrontal cortex requires immense metabolic energy to run. Under normal conditions, when you have a high HRV, your prefrontal cortex is firmly in the driver's seat. It actively inhibits the amygdala, which is the primitive, fear-driven, emotional center of the brain, deep in the temporal lobe.
So the prefrontal cortex tells the amygdala, calm down, this drop in the market is just a temporary correction, we don't need to panic.
Exactly. But when you are under severe compounding stress, when that internal load gets too high and your HRV plummets, the prefrontal cortex effectively runs out of gas. It goes completely offline. The inhibition lifts, and the amygdala completely hijacks the system.
An amygdala hijack.
The primitive brain takes over entirely. You lose your capacity for critical thinking. You experience cognitive rigidity, hypervigilance, and a loss of fine motor control. In a tactical environment, an operator clearing a room might experience tunnel vision, fail to process peripheral threats, or make a fatal target identification error.
And in a financial environment, a portfolio manager watching their screens bleed red might suddenly override all of their carefully designed risk protocols and panic sell everything at the absolute bottom. Their amygdala is literally screaming, "Flee the predator!" And there's no prefrontal cortex left to tell them the predator is just a fluctuating number on a screen.
And that's why tracking HRV is so powerful. We are no longer guessing about a professional's cognitive state. We can objectively measure the physiological cost of a decision, and we can see if an individual's biological resources are dangerously depleted before they are forced to make a high-stakes call.
Wait, okay, let me push back on this. Does tracking this actually help in the moment? Because if I'm a portfolio manager watching a market crash, or I'm an entrepreneur whose main client just pulled out, and my smartwatch starts vibrating to tell me my HRV is tanking and my amygdala is taking over, that's just going to induce a panic attack.
Oh, for sure.
You're creating a negative feedback loop where the stress of being told I'm stressed makes me infinitely more stressed.
That's a highly valid concern, and is precisely why the practical research emphasizes that HRV should almost never be used to induce real-time alarm bells during an acute event. You don't look at it in the middle of a firefight or a market crash.
So when do you look at it?
It is primarily a tool for trend analysis and managing chronic load. You measure it in the morning right after waking up to gauge baseline readiness. If an operator's baseline HRV has been chronically suppressed for 5 days straight, the commander knows their biological engine is running on fumes.
You bench them.
Exactly. You don't send them on the most dangerous, complex breach that night. You bench them. You adjust their training load. It's about proactive resource allocation, not mid-crisis alarms.
But what happens when there is no commander to bench you? I mean, we've just mapped out how humans handle stress inside structured organizations like the military or a massive Wall Street bank.
Yeah.
But the reality of modern work is drastically shifting away from those structures. What happens when the stress is chronic, the load is entirely self-managed, and the individual is completely removed from the safety net of a team?
Then we step into the reality of the freelance economy. And the qualitative research from Babson College forces us to look at risk management through the lens of extreme professional isolation.
The numbers in this study are staggering. In 2020, there were 59 million freelancers in the United States alone, and that number is projected to hit 90 million in the coming years.
That is a massive chunk of the global workforce operating as complete islands. And historically, organizational psychology has viewed isolation as a purely negative, detrimental state that must be solved. The corporate world assumes that being alone inherently damages productivity and well-being.
But the researchers make a really vital, nuanced distinction between isolation and loneliness, don't they?
They do, and it's a huge distinction. Isolation is objective. It is the physical, geographic state of being alone. You are sitting in your home office with the door closed. Loneliness, on the other hand, is subjective. It is defined as the unpleasant psychological discrepancy between the social relationships you want and the social relationships you actually have.
Right, so you can be surrounded by 100 people on a bustling trading floor and feel profoundly, dangerously lonely. Conversely, you can be entirely isolated in a cabin in the woods for weeks and feel deeply fulfilled and connected.
And what the research reveals is that successful freelancers don't just passively endure their physical isolation, they actively engineer it. They manage it through two distinct pathways. First, they reduce isolation selectively by seeking out specific communities of practice, online forums, local meetups to share knowledge and troubleshoot workflows.
Okay, but the second pathway is the really disruptive finding. They strategically leverage their isolation to protect their well-being.
Yes.
They use the physical distance from a corporate hierarchy to adopt a deliberate anti-growth stance.
Leveraging isolation. It completely shatters the traditional corporate paradigm. These freelancers actively cultivate an anti-hustle mindset. They aggressively say no to new clients, new projects, and more revenue in order to preserve their autonomy and prevent the exact kind of chronic biological depletion, the crashed HRV that we just talked about.
This is a direct challenge to the foundational assumptions built into traditional economic and risk models. If you look at the CFA text, or any standard macroeconomic theory, the fundamental assumption is that actors in a market are rational agents seeking to maximize growth, scale, and profit.
The classic capitalist imperative.
Yeah.
More scale, more efficiency, infinite growth.
Precisely. But the Babson research proves that millions of isolated practitioners flat out reject that imperative. They identify primarily as craftspeople, not entrepreneurs.
Right. They care deeply about improving the quality of their craft, whether they are graphic designers, software engineers, or freelance writers. They view the business activities of marketing, scaling, and hiring as a necessary evil, not the goal.
They are prioritizing hedonic well-being, the day-to-day experience of happiness and positive emotion, and eudaimonic well-being, the deeper sense of authenticity, purpose, and thriving.
To put an image to this, the anti-growth stance is like a gardener making a very deliberate choice to cultivate a perfectly balanced, meticulously pruned bonsai tree rather than trying to grow a massive, sprawling oak tree that takes over the entire property.
I love that analogy.
The bonsai brings immense joy, it requires immense skill, and crucially, it is manageable by one person. The oak tree eventually requires a logging crew, heavy machinery, and infinite resources.
That is the exact ethos. They want the bonsai. And because their goal isn't massive organizational scale, the way they assess and digest risk is fundamentally individualized. Their risk management isn't a VAR model. It's the ability to turn down a toxic client without going bankrupt.
Exactly.
But let me challenge the reality of that for a second. Isn't the anti-hustle mindset an incredible luxury? I mean, can a brand new freelance designer who is staring down rent and health insurance premiums actually afford to say no to a demanding client just to protect their internal biological load? Or is this anti-growth strategy exclusively the domain of highly established freelancers who already have a massive safety net of recurring revenue?
The researchers address this directly, actually, and it is a critical friction point. Learning to find that balance between financial survival and biological depletion involves massive experimentation and often painful failure. It absolutely is a privilege of the established to easily decline work.
So how do the newcomers survive?
This is where the community aspect of freelancing steps in to replace the corporate guardrails. The established freelancers actively mentor the newer ones within these communities of practice. They pass down the tacit knowledge that taking every single gig, especially from clients exhibiting toxic behaviors, inevitably leads to burnout.
So they teach the newcomers that overextending your capacity is a form of existential risk that threatens your long-term survival in the craft.
Exactly. The community essentially functions as a decentralized risk management framework.
Okay, so community wisdom replaces the corporate HR department and the chief risk officer. But this creates a massive systemic tension. We've just established that the ground-level reality for millions of isolated workers is completely contrary to traditional economic models of endless growth.
Yeah, the models are fundamentally misaligned.
When you have localized, hyper-specific realities like the freelancer's anti-growth stance or the tactical operator's HRV, clashing with broad theoretical macro models, a massive knowledge gap forms.
And that gap is nowhere more dangerous than in the financial markets, which brings us directly to the macro-level disconnect explored in the systemic risk literature. The persistent structural chasm between industry practitioners and academic researchers.
The industry versus academia gap. The people who are actually in the trenches trading the money versus the people in the universities building the mathematical models of how the money should behave. And according to the text, this gap is wide, and it is deep.
The root cause of this gap goes back to the principal agent problem we discussed in segment 1, mismatched incentives. Industry practitioners, the quantitative analysts, the proprietary traders, the hedge fund managers, they are incentivized purely by profit, survival, and managing risk in real-time, highly volatile environments. Academic researchers, on the other hand, operate in a completely different ecosystem. They are incentivized by the need to publish novel papers in prestigious peer-reviewed journals, to contribute to abstract theory, and to secure university tenure.
The text makes a fascinating historical point here. Quantitative finance, the heavy math that drives modern algorithmic trading, was actually developed largely in the private sector, deep inside banks and investment firms. It didn't start in the ivory tower.
No, it didn't.
And because the financial industry is fiercely, ruthlessly competitive, it operates on a culture of extreme secrecy. You can't really patent a high-frequency trading algorithm. If you figure out an edge, you guard it with your life. Information only moves through whispers, or when a trader jumps ship to a rival firm and takes the tacit knowledge in their head with them.
And this extreme secrecy creates what the literature calls a one-way flow of information. Practitioners constantly read academic papers to mine them for theoretical ideas that might spark new trading strategy. But practitioners almost never publish their own winning strategies in academic journals. Why on earth would they give away their alpha to their competitors?
They wouldn't.
Exactly. As a direct result, academics are forced to study historical data and market anomalies that the practitioners have often already identified, exploited, and arbitraged out of existence. The academics are inherently subjected to a massive time lag.
It's like academia is a map maker sitting in a high tower, meticulously drawing a beautiful, scientifically accurate map of a jungle based on surveyor nodes from 5 years ago. Meanwhile, the practitioner is an explorer hacking their way through the actual mud of the jungle with a machete.
Right.
By the time the academic finally publishes their peer-reviewed map, the river has already changed course, the terrain is different, and the explorer is navigating an entirely new reality.
That analogy perfectly illustrates the systemic risk embedded in this dynamic. The people creating the theoretical risk models, who often advise the government regulators setting the rules, are completely isolated from the people actually executing the trades. Because of this isolation, the academic models frequently fail to account for real-world market microstructure.
What does market microstructure actually mean in this context?
It refers to the nitty-gritty mechanics of how trades actually happen. Academics often build models assuming a frictionless, perfectly liquid market where you can buy or sell any asset instantly at the quoted price.
Which is never true.
Never. But the practitioner knows that the market is full of friction. They deal with hidden liquidity traps, massive bid-ask spreads, transaction costs, and most importantly, the behavioral herding and amygdala hijacks we discussed earlier. The academic model assumes a perfectly rational actor. The practitioner knows the actor is a biologically depleted human running on adrenaline.
But hold on. If the practitioners are so far ahead of the academics, if they have all the secret sauce, the proprietary algorithms, and the frontline experience, why do major financial institutions still blow up?
That's the million-dollar question.
Why do we still have catastrophic 2008-style avalanches? If the explorer knows the jungle so well, why do they keep driving the Jeep into the quicksand?
Because of the siloing effect within the industry itself. The knowledge gap isn't just between academia and industry, it's between departments inside the same bank.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The quantitative analyst building the mathematical pricing model might be sitting in a quiet office in London, totally disconnected from the chaotic reality of the trading floor in New York. The risk management executive might be looking at aggregate VIR numbers, completely missing the subtle dynamic shifts happening at the individual trader level. And the trader executing the deal might not actually understand the complex calculus underlying the quants model.
So they are all touching different parts of the elephant, but nobody has the integrated knowledge to see the whole animal.
Exactly. The practitioners possess the localized micro-knowledge of how the friction works, but they lack the macro integration to see the avalanche forming. And the academics have the macro theories, but their models lack the micro-reality of human biology and market friction.
Which leaves us with a terrifying question. If the standard academic models are lagging behind reality and the frontline practitioners are stuck in their isolated silos, how do we actually map the true causes of systemic changes? How do we know what is actually driving the economy rather than just endlessly reacting to the symptoms?
That brings us to our next stack of research from the Federal Reserve Bank, analyzing the hunt for the economic prime movers.
Okay, the prime mover view of economics is a foundational theory. It basically argues that the fluctuations in economic activity, the booms, the recessions, the inflationary spirals, are fundamentally caused by a few massive underlying forces.
We are talking about colossal shifts. Major changes in monetary and fiscal policy by central banks, massive demographic shifts like the retirement of the baby boomer generation, disruptive technological innovations like the internet or artificial intelligence, or severe supply shocks like a global drought or an oil embargo.
And different schools of economic thought, Keynesians, monetarists, supply-siders will spend decades bickering over which specific prime mover is the most important. But they all generally agree on the premise. These fundamental forces are the engines driving the macroeconomic train.
Right.
But the Federal Reserve paper points out a massive, glaring paradox in how we actually monitor this. If prime movers are the definitive cause of economic cycles, why are they almost completely invisible in our official indexes of leading economic indicators?
It is a profound omission. The author of the study analyzed the leading economic indicators for 21 different OECD countries. These are the advanced economies of the world. Out of all the individual data components these countries use to predict where their economy is heading, variables related to prime movers accounted for barely 20%.
That's wild.
Yeah, for example, across all 21 countries, there were only 18 data series measuring money supply.
So what are the other 80% of the indicators actually measuring?
They're simply measuring the early stages of a production sequence. They measure things like new orders for manufactured goods or the number of residential housing permits issued in a given month.
Relying on those traditional leading indicators to predict systemic risk is like trying to predict a massive storm by looking at puddles forming on your driveway instead of looking up at the atmospheric radar.
That's a perfect analogy.
The puddle tells you that it is raining right now or that it just started. But the puddle gives you absolutely zero information about the massive low-pressure system and the jet stream that actually caused the rain.
That's a vital way to understand it. Measuring an uptick in housing permits tells you that builders feel confident today. But it doesn't tell you why they feel confident or, more importantly, if the central bank is quietly preparing to hike interest rates next month, which will completely crush that confidence. We are measuring the echoes, not the shout.
So why are prime movers hidden? I mean, if they are so important, why don't economists just put them front and center on the dashboard?
The paper explains that it is mathematically and statistically incredibly difficult to isolate them. And the difficulty lies in the complex interplay between what we call endogenous and exogenous components.
Let's break those terms down, because understanding the difference is crucial to understanding complex systems.
An endogenous component is a predictable internal reaction generated from within the economic system itself. It is a feedback loop. For example, if a recession hits and unemployment spikes, the government automatically collects less in income taxes, and it automatically pays out more in unemployment benefits. That resulting shift in the government budget deficit is endogenous. It is a structural reaction to the state of the economy.
Okay, so what is exogenous?
An exogenous component is an unexpected innovation, shock, or policy change introduced from outside the normal functioning of the system. It's an external catalyst. An example would be the central bank unexpectedly slashing interest rates to zero during a weekend emergency meeting, or a sudden massive breakthrough in commercial fusion power.
So the problem for the risk manager or the economist looking at a simple chart of, say, government spending is that the line on the graph is a messy, tangled combination of both endogenous reactions and exogenous shocks. It's incredibly hard to tell which part of the movement is the prime mover causing the change and which part is just the system's mechanical reaction to the change.
Exactly. Which is why the author of the paper suggests we must abandon simplistic linear models and adopt the methodology of system dynamics to untangle the mess.
System dynamics. This is the field created by J. Forrester at MIT in the 1950s, right?
Yeah.
And its origins are a masterclass in uncovering hidden risks.
The story of J. Forrester at the General Electric appliance plant is unbelievable. It perfectly illustrates everything we've talked about regarding human behavior and systemic risk. Forrester was brought in to consult with the managers at a massive GE factory. The managers were absolutely tearing their hair out because their employment levels were violently fluctuating on a strict 3-year cycle.
They were constantly hiring hundreds of workers, running triple shifts, and then violently laying them off a year later.
And the GE executives universally blamed these massive swings on the macroeconomic business cycle. They assumed it was an exogenous shock. They thought the broader economy was simply unpredictable and volatile, and they were just victims of the storm.
But Forrester didn't just look at aggregate data. He built a comprehensive model of their specific factory floor and their specific management processes. He mapped out the system using stocks, flows, time delays, and causal loop diagrams. He documented the exact step-by-step rules the managers use to make decisions about inventory levels and hiring.
And what he proved originally through painstaking hand calculations before the era of modern computing, by the way, it was revolutionary. He proved that the instability was not external at all.
They were doing it to themselves.
They were entirely doing it to themselves.
Oh.
Forrester's model showed that a completely minor, random 5% drop in retail sales at the consumer level would trigger a slight panic in the regional distributors. Because of time delays in information, the distributors would cut their orders to the factory by 10% just to be safe.
Oh, the human factor, the principal agent problem, and the amygdala hijack creeping in.
Exactly. Then, the factory managers, seeing a 10% drop in orders and fearing a massive inventory glut, would overreact and slash their production schedule by 20%. This required massive layoffs.
Wow.
By the time retail sales normalized a few months later, the factory was critically understaffed, inventory was depleted, and they had to aggressively overhire and pay massive overtime to catch up. The massive whiplash destroying their workforce was entirely caused by the factory's own internal management policies and delayed feedback loops.
This is the immense power of system dynamics. It allows us to analyze nonlinear complex systems. It proves that the underlying structure of a system, the circular, interlocking, time-delayed relationships between the people and the data, is often vastly more important in determining its behavior than the individual components themselves.
To truly manage macro risk, we can't just look at a simple chart of economic turning points or bivariate correlations. We have to use system dynamics to separate the expected endogenous reactions from the true, unexpected exogenous shocks, the prime movers that cascade through the system and create those devastating feedback loops.
But let's ground this in reality for a second. Even if we use system dynamics and successfully identify a prime mover, the text notes a frustrating reality about business cycles. A single shock can generate repeating cyclical ripples that last for years or even decades.
Yeah, the ripples don't stop.
So if a prime mover happened 5 years ago, say, a major regulatory overhaul or demographic cliff, and it's still causing ripples in the market, is identifying that original shock practically useful for a risk manager trying to make a decision on a chaotic trading floor today at 2:00 p.m.
You've just articulated the exact friction point between academia and industry. The academic researcher cares deeply about the ultimate exogenous cause from 5 years ago because they are trying to perfect the theoretical architecture of their model. The industry risk manager on the trading floor only cares about the sudden evaporation of liquidity happening at 2:00 p.m. today.
Right.
But the harsh reality is you absolutely need both perspectives. If the risk manager doesn't understand the delayed structural ripples initiated by that prime mover 5 years ago, they will misinterpret the 2:00 p.m. liquidity trap as a random, unpredictable exogenous event rather than a completely predictable endogenous structural outcome of the system they are actually operating in.
Which brings us to our final and perhaps most vital transition of this deep dive. We've identified that the ultimate underlying risk, the thing that creates avalanches, is a profound lack of integrated knowledge.
Yes.
Whether it's the biological reality of an operator's HRV being completely ignored by their commander, millions of freelancers operating in isolated silos without corporate guardrails, academic risk models completely missing the ground floor friction of the trading pit, or executives confusing their own internal feedback loops for macroeconomic weather. The failure is universally a failure to integrate.
So the ultimate question becomes, how do we successfully integrate vast amounts of specialized, isolated knowledge to manage chronic systemic risks at scale?
To answer that, we turn to our final stack of research: comparative case studies in public healthcare.
It is a perfect parallel to everything we've discussed.
Right.
Western healthcare has undergone a massive fundamental paradigm shift over the last century. Historically, the entire system was architected to treat acute diseases and injuries in a localized setting, the hospital. You break your arm, you go to the hospital, the doctor sets the bone, you leave, the transaction is complete.
It's the broken X-ray machine from our introduction. The problem is visible, localized, and acute.
Exactly. But today, thanks to longer lifespans and modern lifestyles, the overwhelming burden crushing global healthcare systems isn't acute injury, it is chronic disease. We are talking about diabetes, congestive heart failure, severe cognitive disorders, and chronic respiratory issues. You cannot fix these in a single isolated hospital visit.
Managing chronic disease requires continuous coordinated care across a massive, decentralized network of professionals. A single patient might need a general practitioner, a specialist endocrinologist, a dietitian, a community nurse, and a mental health professional.
The patient with a chronic disease is exactly like a highly complex, multi-asset financial portfolio. You can't just have one isolated trader looking at the portfolio once a year. You need an integrated team managing the compounding risks over decades.
Right.
To understand how to achieve this integration, the source paper compares two different structural models attempting to solve this crisis within what are called beverage model healthcare systems.
For the listener, a beverage model system is essentially a system where healthcare is both provided and financed directly by the government through national tax payments, like the National Health Service in the UK.
The researchers analyzed clinical commissioning groups, or CCGs, in the United Kingdom and contrasted them with the Case della Salute, or CDS, in the Emilia-Romagna region of Italy.
Let's start with the CCGs in the UK. The paper highlights the Milton Keynes CCG, which serves a population of about 266,000 people. The defining characteristic of the CCG is that it is highly decentralized.
Very decentralized.
They are local consortiums of general practitioners that are given massive autonomy. They manage their own regional budgets, they define their own localized priorities based on the specific demographics of their area, and they even place specialized roles like a chief knowledge officer directly on their governing board.
Their primary method of managing risk is developing specific, standardized clinical pathways for prevalent chronic conditions, like diabetes or stroke recovery. They map out the exact sequence of care, and then they share these pathways online via central repositories, so every isolated doctor in the region is working from the same integrated playbook.
Now, contrast that with the Italian CDS model. The CDS system is much younger, and it operates on a heavily centralized philosophy. The overarching regional health authority dictates the specific projects, the budgets, and the medical protocols from the top down. Furthermore, they structure their integration around very specific, localized functional roles rather than just digital databases. They utilize a clinical manager who is always a physician responsible for coordinating the strictly medical processes, and a care manager who is typically a highly specialized nurse responsible for coordinating the broader network of healthcare and social professionals around the patient.
If we look at this structurally, the UK's CCG system sounds like a decentralized franchise model. Think of a massive fast food chain where the local franchise owners have a tremendous amount of leeway to adjust the menu, the hours, and the marketing based on their specific local neighborhood's tastes, but they still share the most successful recipes with the corporate knowledge base.
And the Italian CDS, on the other hand, is like a tightly controlled corporate rollout. Headquarters in Emilia-Romagna dictates the exact menu, the exact uniform, and the exact operating procedure for every single location to ensure absolute standardization and prevent any deviation from the protocol.
That is a highly accurate comparison. But what's truly fascinating here, and what ties our entire deep dive together, is that despite their massive structural differences, decentralized versus centralized, both systems are fundamentally trying to execute the exact same strategy: knowledge management.
The paper breaks knowledge management down into 8 sequential stages. Let's walk through those because this is the blueprint for managing systemic risk anywhere.
The 8 stages are identifying core competencies within the network, capturing that knowledge from the individuals, selecting the most effective practices, storing them systematically, sharing them across the silos, applying them to new patients, creating new knowledge from the outcomes, and finally, selling or promoting that new standard of care back into the broader system.
The ultimate goal of those 8 stages is transformation. It is transforming tacit knowledge into explicit knowledge.
Let's define those.
Tacit knowledge is the deeply ingrained, unspoken stuff locked inside a seasoned professional's head. It's the 10 years of experience, the subtle intuition, the ability to read a patient's microexpressions or sense a shift in market momentum. Explicit knowledge is a codified clinical pathway, an operational protocol, or a searchable database that any rookie in the organization can instantly access and understand.
And this transformation is the universal key to mitigating systemic chronic risk. Whether you are a regional health authority managing the cascading risk of a diabetes epidemic across a population of 300,000, or you are a chief risk officer managing the chronic exposure of a global investment bank across 50 isolated trading desks, the solution is identical. You have to break down the professional silos through standardized, accessible knowledge management. You have to extract the tacit knowledge out of the individual expert's head and embed it directly into the structural architecture of the system.
But I have to interrupt and challenge the fundamental premise of that. The healthcare text talks very cleanly about turning professional expertise into easily stored explicit knowledge. But let's rewind and link this back to our Wall Street traders, our tactical military operators, and the biology of HRV.
Okay.
We established extensively in segment 2 that the most valuable, life-saving risk management knowledge is often highly intuitive. It's the human factor. It is based on a visceral gut feeling, rapid pattern recognition, and crucially, the available physiological capacity of your autonomic nervous system. Can you truly store and share an elite tactical operator's high HRV or a veteran trader's hard-won intuition in a centralized database? Isn't the deepest knowledge inherently untransferable?
You have zeroed in on the ultimate limitation of knowledge management. You are absolutely right. You cannot put human intuition in a database. You cannot upload a veteran trader's gut feeling to a cloud server, and you certainly cannot download an experienced operator's parasympathetic HRV reserve into a stressed-out rookie's nervous system. The biological hardware is non-transferable. However, what you can do, and what these systems are designed to do, is explicitly document the environmental conditions under which that biological intuition either thrives or catastrophically fails.
Ah, you map the boundaries.
Precisely. You can't store the trader's gut feeling, but you can build a system dynamic model that explicitly states. Historical data proves that when market volatility index VIX hits level X and our portfolio leverage ratio is Y, human beings universally tend to experience an amygdala hijack, panic, and herd. Therefore, our explicit protocol, our avalanche damage control beacon, is to automatically and algorithmically reduce our leverage, removing the decision from the stressed human entirely.
So you build explicit structural guardrails to protect the fragile tacit intuition.
Yes. In the healthcare models, the rigid clinical pathway doesn't exist to replace the veteran doctor's intuition. It exists to ensure that the foundational, evidence-based steps are never missed on a chaotic Tuesday. This deliberately frees up the doctor's metabolic cognitive resources, their prefrontal cortex, to handle the complex, nuanced anomalies that no database could ever predict.
Okay, that brings all the threads together beautifully. We've covered an immense amount of ground today, moving from the microscopic to the macroeconomic. We started with the biological, neurological reality of risk, how the tug-of-war in our autonomic nervous system and the variance in our heartbeats dictate our ability to maintain prefrontal cortex control under pressure.
We then explored how individuals manage chronic risk when removed from a hierarchy, looking at how millions of freelancers leverage isolation and adopt anti-growth stances to protect their biological load and their craft.
We scaled up to examine the dangerous knowledge gaps and siloed realities between academic mapmakers and industry explorers in quantitative finance, revealing how theoretical models fail when they ignore market friction and human panic.
We hunted for systemic causality, realizing that we must use system dynamics to untangle endogenous reactions from the true exogenous prime movers that drive massive cycles of boom and bust.
And finally, we analyzed how massive public healthcare systems attempt to solve this overarching crisis of chronic risk by systematically integrating isolated, tacit knowledge into explicit, shared protocols.
The overarching lesson is that risk is never merely a quantitative number on a spreadsheet. It is a living, breathing, complex system of human behaviors, biological capacities, and interlocking feedback loops.
Which brings us to our final provocative thought for you to take away from this deep dive. As a society, we spend billions of dollars and countless hours engineering incredibly sophisticated technological systems to measure external loads. We launch GPS satellites, we lay transatlantic fiber optic cables for high-frequency trading, we build massive centralized electronic patient record databases, we have designed the most powerful external X-ray machines in human history.
But as we rapidly move into a future defined by increasingly complex, nonlinear, and chronically compounding risks, perhaps the ultimate prime mover we need to be monitoring isn't external at all. Perhaps the true prime mover, the fundamental engine of systemic stability, is our own.
So, think about your own context. The next time you face a high-stakes decision, whether you are managing a massive corporate team, navigating a freelance contract, or just trying to survive a chaotic week, before you obsess over the spreadsheet, before you check the external market indicators, take a moment to honestly assess your own internal load. Are you driving the engine at 7,000 RPMs with a completely empty coolant reservoir? Because you cannot successfully manage the complex risks out there until you manage the biological risk in here. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Take care of yourselves, and we'll see you next time.